The sea was a constant, indifferent companion. For 5 years, Eleanor, Duchess of Blackwood, had learned its moods, the shifting grey of its surface a mirror for the placid stillness she had cultivated within herself. Seacliff Manor, her gilded cage in Cornwall, clung to the cliffs like a hardy, wind-scoured shell. It was a house of echoes and draughts, a place meant for forgetting. And she, by all accounts, had been forgotten. She had been a bride for 2 days. On the third, a carriage had arrived, her husband's steward presenting her with a sealed document and a purse heavy enough to be insulting. It was not a request, it was a command. Alastair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, whose ring felt like a cold shackle on her finger, required her to remove herself to this remote corner of his vast holdings. There were no explanations, only the chilling finality of the arrangement. He had stood beside his mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. He had not even met her gaze. Now, at 24, Eleanor was neither wife nor widow. She was a ghost in her own life, the mistress of a forgotten estate. The locals knew her as the reclusive Duchess, a London phantom who managed her lands with a quiet, surprising efficiency. She had learned. In the echoing silence of the manor's library, surrounded by books on agriculture, economics and law, she had educated herself. She had taken the insult of her exile and forged it into a shield of competence. Despair was a luxury she had shed years ago, leaving only a cool, watchful resignation in its place. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the sky the colour of a fresh bruise over the churning sea. It was carried by a rider whose horse was lathered. The urgency of its journey a stark contrast to the monotonous rhythm of her life. The seal was the Blackwood crest, a wolf's head she had not seen since the day she was dismissed. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, held the silver tray with trembling hands. Eleanor took the letter. The parchment was thick, expensive. The handwriting within, however, was a barely controlled scrawl. It was his. She had seen it only once, on their marriage certificate. Return to London at once, come to Blackwood House. It was not signed with affection or even courtesy, only his title, stark and commanding, Blackwood. For a long moment she simply stared at the words. He had remembered she existed. The thought sent a sudden unwelcome chill through her, a tremor of a life she had meticulously buried. He had sent her away like she was nothing. And now he summoned her. Mrs. Gable watched her face a knot of concern. "Your Grace?" The older woman whispered. "Is it bad news?" Eleanor folded the letter, the sharp crease a decisive sound in the quiet room. "I cannot yet say," she replied, her voice even, "but it appears I am wanted in London." She felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. Not excitement, not fear. It was the feeling of a long dormant gear beginning to turn, its grinding protest echoing through the stillness of her world. She had a choice. She could burn the letter, remain here by the sea, and let the Duke of Blackwood face whatever crisis had prompted this desperate, graceless summons alone. Or she could go. She looked out the window at the grey, relentless waves crashing against the rocks below. For 5 years she had been passive, an object moved from one place to another. The letter was a command, but in her power to obey or ignore it, she felt the first flicker of agency. He had no idea who he was summoning. He expected the timid 19-year-old girl he had discarded. He would not get her. The journey to London was a disorienting blur of green countryside transforming into the grime and noise of the city. Blackwood House stood on a grand square, a monolithic statement of power and wealth. But as her carriage drew to a halt before it, Eleanor saw the signs of decay. The windows were grimy, One of the grand urns flanking the entrance was cracked, and the usually immaculate black paint on the door was chipped. A sense of unease, potent and cloying, hung in the air. The butler who opened the door was a man she did not recognize, his face etched with worry. He looked at her, his gaze flicking from her simple travelling dress to her face, confusion warring with duty. "May I help you, madam?" "I am the Duchess of Blackwood," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm. The words felt foreign on her tongue. The man's eyes widened in shock. He stammered an apology, bowing low and ushering her into the cavernous hall. The silence inside was a physical presence, clinging to the damask curtains like dust. It was not the peaceful quiet of Seacliff, but a dead, hollow silence. Footsteps were missing. The distant hum of a full staff was absent. A skeleton crew remained, their faces pinched with anxiety. He was in the study. The butler announced her, his voice trembling slightly, and retreated as if fleeing a battle. Alistair was standing by the window, his back to her. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broad beneath a perfectly tailored but slightly frayed coat. He did not turn. "You came," he said. His voice was rough, strained. "You summoned me," she replied, stepping further into the room. It smelled of stale cigar smoke and something else. Fear, he finally turned, and the sight of him stole the breath from her lungs. This was not the cold, arrogantly handsome man from her memory. His dark brown eyes were shadowed, bloodshot with sleeplessness. His face was leaner, carved with lines of stress that hadn't been there 5 years ago. And she saw it then, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand as he held it clenched at his side. "I did not expect you would," he admitted, his gaze falling somewhere over her shoulder, as if he could not quite bring himself to look at her directly. "And yet, here I am," Eleanor said, refusing to let the awkward, heavy silence defeat her. She had not come all this way to be intimidated. Why? The single word hung between them. He gestured vaguely to a chair, but she remained standing. He ran his trembling hand through his dark hair. "Things are complicated. So I gathered from the state of the house," she said coolly. "The staff has been reduced. There are whispers of creditors at the tradesman's entrance. The name Blackwood is on the lips of every gossip columnist, and not in celebration." She had read the papers during her journey. She was not entirely unprepared. His head snapped up, a flicker of the old ducal pride igniting in his eyes. "You have been reading the scandal sheets. I have been educating myself on the state of my husband's affairs," she corrected him gently, "as seems to be my duty, a duty I was denied for 5 years. The retort struck him silent. The tremor in his hand worsened, and he quickly thrust it into his pocket. He looked defeated. "It is a financial matter. A series of investments, a collapse in the South American markets. My father's advisors, my mother's, they were meant to be sound." He spoke in broken phrases, the story tumbling out in a disordered mess of ruin. "They were not. It is a catastrophe." Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable. She had spent years studying these very things, market collapses, foolish investments, the domino effect of panicked selling. She understood the language of his disaster better than he knew. When he finally fell silent, staring at the floor like a condemned man, she did not offer sympathy. She offered something else. "Show me the books," she said. He stared at her, utterly bewildered. "The what?" "The ledgers," she clarified, her voice patient. "The investment portfolios, the debt schedules, all of it. If I am to understand the depth of this catastrophe, I need to see the numbers." Alistair looked at her as if she had suddenly started speaking in a foreign tongue. He saw not the forgotten girl bride, but a woman of unnerving calm and purpose. For the first time since she had entered the room, he truly met her eyes. He saw intelligence there, and a strength that startled him. Hesitantly, as if moving against his own will, he walked to a massive safe behind his desk, worked the combination, and began pulling out heavy, leather-bound ledgers. He piled them on the great mahogany desk. A mountain of failure. "It is all there," he said, his voice hollow. "The ruin of a dynasty." Eleanor walked to the desk, removed her gloves, and opened the topmost ledger. Her fingers, steady and sure, traced the columns of figures. She did not look at him again. She simply began to work. For 3 days, the study became her world. She worked with a singular focus that unnerved the entire household. She ate trays of food brought to the desk, barely noticing what she consumed. She filled pages with notes, her handwriting neat and precise, a stark contrast to the chaotic entries in the ledgers. Alistair found himself a spectator in his own home, watching this stranger who wore his name unravel the mess of his life. He would stand in the doorway for long stretches, simply observing her. He noticed things he had never allowed himself to see before. The elegant line of her neck as she bent over her work, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the quiet intelligence in her eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had dismissed her as insignificant, a plain girl with a good dowry, easily shelved and forgotten. He had been a fool. The woman before him was formidable. One evening he found her asleep in the chair, her head pillowed on her arms atop a pile of account books. A chill had crept into the room. On impulse, he retrieved a cashmere throw from a nearby sofa and gently draped it over her shoulders. She stirred but didn't wake. He stood there for a long moment, the simple protective gesture feeling more intimate than their wedding vows. He was struck by a profound and unfamiliar shame. He had done this to her. He had thrown her away, and in his darkest hour she had returned not with recriminations, but with this quiet, relentless competence. The external pressures mounted. A notice arrived from the bank, a final demand for a payment so large it was laughable. Old friends of the family crossed the street to avoid him. A particularly vicious article was published, detailing the Blackwood ruin with gleeful precision and speculating that the Duke would soon be forced to sell the historic house itself. The walls were closing in, and Alistair felt the cold grip of panic tighten around his throat. His hand trembled almost constantly now. He stormed into the study one afternoon, the bank's letter crushed in his fist. "It's over," he declared, his voice raw. "They'll call in the debt. We are finished." Eleanor did not look up from the map she had spread across the desk. A detailed survey of the Cornish coast. "No, we are not," she said calmly. She used a finger to trace a line along a jagged inlet. "Here, this is Seacliff." She then pointed to a series of smaller, adjacent parcels of land, and these are the tenant farms and coastal lands attached to the manor. Worth very little, according to these ledgers. The land is too rocky for effective farming, the fishing rights considered negligible. It is worthless land. "A place of exile," he said bitterly. "You are thinking of it as land," she replied, finally lifting her eyes to his. They were clear and bright. "You should be thinking of it as a coastline. The new steamships require deeper ports, protected from the worst of the Atlantic storms. This inlet, here, is one of the deepest natural harbours on the entire coast." With a proper quay and warehouse, she let the sentence hang in the air. He stared at the map, then at her, his mind struggling to keep pace. You propose building a port. The idea was audacious, impossible. With what funds? We have nothing. We have the land, she countered, which we can use as collateral to form a new shipping company. Not with your banks, who have lost faith, but with the new money. The industrialists. They need access to the sea. They will invest in infrastructure. Your name, your title, still carries weight with them, even if society has turned its back. It suggests legitimacy. She pushed a sheaf of papers toward him. It was a complete prospectus, outlining costs, potential partners, and projected revenues. She had been working on it for days. He sank into the chair opposite her, stunned into silence. It was brilliant. It was daring. It was a lifeline he never could have conceived of himself. Hope arrived not as a sunrise, but as a single, stubborn star in a vast and empty sky. He saw her then, not just as his rescuer, but as his equal. That evening, they attended a reception they could not afford to miss, a desperate attempt to show the world they were not yet defeated. The chill in the room was palpable. Whispers followed them like a miasma. A rival, Lord Ashworth, a man who had lost a fortune betting against Alistair's failed ventures, approached them, his smile slick with malice. Blackwood, Ashworth drawled, loud enough for those nearby to hear. I am surprised to see you out. I had heard you were measuring the drapes for debtors' prison. Alistair's face went white with fury, his hand balling into a fist. Before he could utter the scathing retort that would only worsen their situation, Eleanor stepped forward slightly, placing a calming hand on his arm. She turned her serene gaze upon Lord Ashworth. Lord Ashworth, she said, her voice carrying easily in the sudden quiet. How kind of you to express such concern. You must forgive my husband his distraction. He is terribly preoccupied with the launch of our new shipping venture in Cornwall. The demand from investors has been quite overwhelming. She smiled, a cool, regal expression. But then, a man of your limited vision could hardly be expected to see the future in a deep water port. She dismissed him with a subtle turn of her shoulder, guiding Alistair away. Ashworth was left speechless, his face mottled with rage and surprise. The whispers that followed them now were of a different sort, of a new venture, of the surprising Duchess of Blackwood. In that moment, Alistair realised she had not only protected his name, but she had also begun to rebuild it. She was not just saving him, she was leading him. Late that night, the house was silent again, wrapped in its shroud of debt and uncertainty. Eleanor found him in the library, a room she had not yet entered. It was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight falling through the tall windows. He was standing before a portrait of a severe-looking woman with cold, unforgiving eyes. The Dowager Duchess, his mother. He did not seem to notice her arrival. He was staring up at the painting, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. She hated weakness, he said, his voice barely a whisper. After my father died, she held this family together with pure, unyielding will. She taught me that our name was everything. That emotion was a liability, control was power. Eleanor remained by the door, a silent witness. She chose you, he continued, his voice thick with a shame so profound it seemed to suffocate him. Your dowry was substantial enough to secure an estate she wanted to acquire. She saw you as suitable, quiet, malleable, and once the papers were signed and the dowry was ours, she decided your presence in London was an unnecessary complication. She said you lacked the polish to be a proper duchess. He finally turned from the portrait to face her, his face a ruin in the moonlight. She told me to send you away, to forget you, and I did it. I was a coward. I was so desperate for her approval, so terrified of being seen as weak in her eyes, that I sacrificed you. I signed the order sending you to Seacliff, and I walked away. His apology, when it came, felt as thin as ice on a winter puddle, threatening to crack under the slightest weight. I convinced myself it was a kindness, that you would be happier away from the pressures of society. It was a lie. I sent you into exile because I was too weak to defy my own mother. I have lived with that shame for 5 years, in this hollow house, with her portrait watching my every failure. He looked utterly broken, stripped of his title, his pride, his name. All that was left was the man, flawed and exposed. He had handed her the truth of his weakness, a confession that gave her all the power. He expected anger, tears, recriminations. He had earned them all. Eleanor walked slowly across the vast room until she stood before him. She looked from his tormented face to the cold eyes in the portrait and then back again. He had been a prisoner just as she had, chained not by stone walls but by the expectations of the dead. She felt a surprising, painful surge of empathy. She reached into the small reticule at her wrist. Her hand emerged holding not a handkerchief but a small object, worn smooth with time. She held it out and placed it on the polished table between them. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings poised for flight. Alastair stared at it, confusion clouding his features. He reached out a trembling hand and touched it, a flicker of a distant memory in his eyes. "My wedding gift to you," he whispered, the recollection dawning with horror. It had been a trinket, something he'd had in his pocket from his travels. He had given it to her on their wedding night with a dismissive word, a meaningless gesture to fill an unbearable silence. "This is what you gave me for 5 years of my life," she said, her voice level, devoid of accusation. It was more powerful for its lack of emotion. A trifle, something to be put on a shelf and forgotten, like me. The truth of her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He finally understood, not just the insult of his neglect, but the profound, crushing loneliness he had sentenced her to. The bird was not just a bird, it was a symbol of her cage, of her worth in his eyes. Nothing, he looked from the bird to her face, and he saw not a duchess, not a saviour, but the woman whose life he had carelessly broken. He could not find the words to ask for forgiveness. The crime was too large, the time lost too vast. He could only whisper her name, a sound of pure desolation. "Eleanor," she watched him, her gaze unwavering. She held all the cards. She could have her revenge now. She could take her brilliant plan, find other investors, and leave him to his ruin. Society would not blame her. Or she could stay. The choice was entirely hers. She pushed the prospectus for the shipping company across the table, nudging the wooden bird aside. "We will save Blackwood," she stated, her voice imbued with a new, unshakable authority. "But not as it was. We will do it as partners. Not as a duke and his forgotten duchess." She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "My name will be on the charter for the Blackwood Coastal Trading Company. As a founding partner, my decisions regarding the Seacliff properties and the port development will be final. You sent me to the sea to be forgotten. I learned its tides. Now you will listen when I speak of them." It was not a plea, it was her terms. She was not asking for a place by his side, she was claiming it. She was rewriting the terms of their marriage, of their entire existence, on her own authority. Alastair looked at the papers, then at her face, which was illuminated by a strength he was only now beginning to comprehend. There was no hesitation. The hollow man who had lived in his mother's shadow was gone, burned away by ruin and shame. In his place was someone who finally saw the path to redemption. "Of course," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was a complete and total surrender of the control he had once prized above all else. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, her power, her right. In that simple agreement, the crushing tension that had filled the house for days finally broke, replaced by a fragile, terrifying, and wondrous hope. A year later, the air at Seacliff Manor smelled of salt and prosperity. The house was no longer a place of exile, but a centre of operations, their preferred home. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The sound of construction drifted up from the coast, the rhythmic hammering of the new quay being built, the shouts of men, the promise of a future. Eleanor stood at the window of her study, the very room where she had spent her lonely years, looking over the shipping manifests. The Blackwood Coastal Trading Company was a success, its ships already plying the routes to France and beyond. Their venture, born of desperation, had thrived on her foresight and his reformed dedication. Alistair entered the room, carrying 2 cups of tea. He moved with a quiet confidence she now knew was his true nature, the frantic, haunted energy of their London reunion gone completely. His hand was steady as he passed her a cup. He came to stand beside her, following her gaze down to the bustling harbour. "The Eleanor makes port this afternoon," he said. "Captain Davies reports a full cargo of French silk and brandy. The profit margins are even better than you projected." She smiled, a genuine warm expression that still felt like a new discovery to him. "My projections are always conservative, Your Grace." He returned the smile. "I have learnt that, Your Grace. They were partners in every sense of the word. They worked together, made decisions together, and in the quiet evenings they were slowly, carefully learning to be husband and wife." The chill of the past had been replaced by a tentative, growing warmth, as real and tangible as the sun on the floorboards. On the mantelpiece, nestled between a sextant and a collection of seashells, sat the small, carved wooden bird. Neither of them ever touched it, but its presence was a constant, silent testament. It was a reminder of a profound cruelty and an even more profound grace. It spoke of what was lost and what, against all odds, had been found. Alistair gently took her free hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He did not need to speak. In his touch, she felt the entirety of his unspoken gratitude, his respect, his burgeoning love. He had sent her away to this cliff by the sea to be erased, a footnote in his life. But in the wind and the waves and the solitude, she had found not oblivion, but herself. She had learnt the deep currents of the world while he had been playing in the shallow waters of society. He had lost a fortune, a reputation, and a name. He had called for help, expecting to command a ghost. But she had come back, not as the girl he had wronged, but as the one thing he needed most, an anchor in the storm. True freedom, she now knew, was not the absence of constraints, but the power to choose one's own shore. And here, together, on the edge of the world that had once been her prison, they had finally, truly, begun to build a home.